Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this academic track closing panel, the academic track of the World Investment Forum this year. This academic track has covered a lot of ground over the course of the week, and today we're going to try to draw that to a conclusion together. My name is Richard Bolwin. I'm the head of the investment research branch in UNCTAD, and I'm going to hand you over to a series of very prominent speakers in the coming 2 hours who will take us through a very diverse set of topics. We're going to start out the session with 2 keynotes, and we will then have a series of speakers in a panel that ranges from all of the various academic areas that we cover also in the World Investment Forum. Anywhere from international economic law to international economics to international business to development economics to technology. We have a wide range of topics. So I will come to that later and introduce the panelists to you, but I'm going to first pass the floor to Mr. James Zahn, whom most of you will know, but he is the director of the Division on Investment and Enterprise in UNCTAD and the lead for the World Investment Report, for his opening remarks. James, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Richard. First of all, eminent panelists and dear participants, welcome to this session. And this is the closing session of the 7th World Investment Forum, the academic track. So it's a great pleasure to open the closing. I would like to thank all the institutions and individuals that contribute to the academic track of this World Investment Forum. And in this edition, we expanded our focus and outreach and bring together leading scholars across the multiple fields, as Richard already said, and that include international economics, development economics, international trade, investment, international law, and international business. So I wish to particularly to thank the Academy of International Business and the Society of International Economic Law. With these 2 institutions, we have a long-standing working relationship. And I would also like to thank the new partners and institutions, including New York University in Abu Dhabi and United Nations World Institute for Development Economic Research and Oxford University Express and the European International Business Association. We all contributed to the successful, prolific, and extensive track of the academic sessions. One of the highlights of the forum was the hybrid track and the hybrid sessions. That's what I would call it, multi-stakeholder sessions, bringing together scholars, policymakers, civil society, and the business leaders to discuss key issues related to investment for sustainable recovery. And this is really from a very broad variety of angles. And jointly that trying to establish the key elements for a policy-oriented research agenda in the years ahead. We've also had a kind of daily roundups led by academia covering the main topics of the World Investment Forum by our diverse stakeholders, community, and the participants from a research angle. So I think there's a slide to share. Is Amelia going to do that? So I just wish to highlight the issues. At the opening plenary of the academic track last Monday, I discussed and outlined the key and emerging issues that drove many of our discussions in the academic track this week, and that I hope that this will lead to a kind of forward-looking research agenda on investment for development. And this is agenda for all of us. And I'm pleased to note that many sessions at the World Investment Forum addressed the questions we raised during the academic opening. So we have virtually all sessions addressed the issue of investing in SDGs, including providing the finance for achieving them in the next decade of action. Likewise, most of the sessions discuss the implications of changing international investment and trade landscape for development, talking about the regional integration, the new investment promotion strategies, the new technologies, new industrial policies, international taxation, the impact of pandemic across the international production and investment systems. We continue discussing on the necessity of reforming international governance of investment. We exchanged the views, methods, ideas on how to partner with the private sector, including family businesses, international institutional investors, large MNEs, but also micro and small, medium-sized enterprises, and to achieve a kind of a more inclusive and a gender equal economy. So it's quite challenging to summarize. Here's the graph that Amelia and Richard put together that gives the idea of what I highlighted at the very beginning of the track in 6 issue areas: that global economic governance realignment, the transformation of GVC, international production, industrial policies, the implications of new industrial revolution for development strategies, the impact of the sustainability imperatives on international production, the shift from industries to infrastructure investment, and the drive for increased corporate accountability. So that's on the left side. If you see on the right hand side, all these events listed are really corresponding to the framework, and we have had extensive discussion thanks to you, the distinguished panelists' contribution, and as well as the contribution from the participants and academic friends during the last 4 days. I think we have all the elements on board. I wouldn't summarize them. I think this will be done eventually in the kind of academic paper in the journal. But here, before I conclude, I just wish to emphasize what are the policy core of the type. I would say that priorities for policy agenda, that Peter used to call it the big challenges, I would say. So the first is really to update industrial and investment policies in the era of globalization, of the global value chain transformation. In this transformation, we need updating industrial policies and investment policies. The second policy agenda is to boost the investment in SDGs. We need effective action plan for that. And the third is reforming the international investment treaty regime to fit into the modern times, particularly in light of the current global economic governance context. It's evolved so rapidly over the past few years. The fourth one is multilateralism for investment. How can we do that in the absence of multilateral investment system, and how we deal with this? And UNCTAD's approach is called a soft approach in global investment policy making, that and even against the trends of regionalization, nationalization in terms of investment policy making. So these are the policy agenda, I think, that needs evidence-based support from research support from academic, from you, and that concludes my my opening of the closing, and look forward to the discussion with and hearing you, the eminent experts. I wish really to thank my colleagues, Rich and Amelia, for the whole for the design and organizing the whole thing together with our partners. Thank you. Back to you, Richard, now.
Thank you very much, James. I think that was a very nice summary of where we've got to. We started out with your opening speech, which I think built very much on the thinking of the last 2 years on the future direction of of research. And we added a few themes to that. And it was just a list of about 10 or 15 WIF sessions that I saw there on the right-hand side. And we had 91 in total. So really, we would be able to expand on that quite a lot. I think that everything in some way has been has received some new thinking and new impetus from participants at the WIF. So it's going to be a challenge putting that together into a fully fledged new framework, but we're going to give it a try. So thanks, James, for starting this off. I would now pass the floor to Farouk Contractor, the president of the Academy of International Business, to start with a scene-setting starting address. Farouk, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So a lot of my remarks, of course, deal with research topics that I think are going to be important in the coming years. And this is based on an article I have written for the Journal of International Business Studies, which is the premier journal of the AIB, or the Academy of International Business. And I'm going to have to be very quick, but those who are interested can look at the 85 references in the article. So there's plenty of research topics which are equally important, but here are the few that I have been able to come up with. First of all, better measurements for globalization. We do have fairly good data on capital and trade, not so good data on the cross-border flows of technology, and not at all good data on the cross-border transmission of effective institutional and corporate practices, with the multinational company being the transmitter or the bridging agent for that. For example, in technology, we have data on royalties and fees, but we have no idea of the strategic impact of that on business internationally. So if you, these are numbers that I came up with roughly ballpark from 2017 to 2019. Of course, things fell apart in 2020, but you see that there are three major methods of reaching foreign customers, reaching foreign markets, which is trade, FDI, and then the transfer of technology through licensing, which has reached something like 2019, it reached 400 billion. But if you divide that number by a royalty rate, which is completely unknown, and that's where the research needs to be done. Let's say you divide 400 billion by 0.02 or 2% royalty rate, you come up with a certain figure. If you divide it by an 8% royalty rate, you come up with a different figure. So the best guess I can come up with is that the sales resulting from the cross-border transfer of knowledge or technology or capability is somewhere between 5 and 7 trillion, which is, yes, a distant number 3 compared to FDI, affiliate sales, or the sum total of world exports. But certainly it's an important enough component of international business that needs to be researched. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the multinational enterprise acts as a cross-border bridging agent, a transmitter of internal proprietary capabilities, a diffuser of best practices in management, technology, and also a contributor to higher standards in ethics, sustainability practices, labor treatment, and CSR, what we used to call in the old literature the demonstration effect. Another interesting question to me, at least, is why FDI is so skewed. And of course, the obvious answer is that nations are very, economic size of nations are very skewed. When you're looking at rank 20, you're already talking about very small economies in terms of their contribution to global GDP. And below rank 50, you're talking about not only very, very tiny economies, but also politically risky countries. So it's a highly skewed distribution. Another interesting research question to me is companies are increasingly fine slicing their R&D value chain. I don't mean the entire value chain, just the R&D portion is being sliced and different functions being allocated to different locations. And then, of course, the reconfiguration of value-added locations with the coming new tax regimes. And international tax avoidance, by the way, will not disappear because multinational companies have multiple means of shifting profits through international tax avoidance techniques. And talking about nationalism and protectionism, that's another area that needs to be studied in the future years. But increased nationalism and protectionism doesn't necessarily mean reduction in FDI. In fact, we know from a long time that there's something called tariff jumping FDI. And when countries like India talk about self-reliance, I tell them that you cannot have self-reliance without FDI. And of course, right now, that idea is not sufficiently developed, so they look at me with incomprehension in their eyes. But the point is that even for self-sufficiency or greater nationalism or localization, you need foreign inputs. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just jump to the next issue, which is something in the Gibbs paper, which is the reconfiguration of global value chains. And the main focus from a manager's point of view, of course, is the cost per unit of procured item, because the whole idea of GVCs, the fundamental idea from a management point of view, is to reduce costs. And astonishingly, in the supply chain literature, I've been unable to find any empirical study that illustrates this paradigm of mine, which is a J-curve relationship in terms of the cost per unit procured. And on the x-axis, we have the number of suppliers for the same item around the world, geographical diversification, geographical distance, political. You can actually construct an index for explanatory variables in terms of political, cultural, and geographical distance. So as we go from left to right, the degree of risk comes down, which is, of course, now becoming an increasingly important issue for the resilience of GVCs. But on the other hand, there are emerging technologies such as blockchain or the networking of vendor-buyer computer systems or artificial intelligence, which produces predictive analytics on with a more accurate forecasting of demand and hence lower risk. So these emerging technologies are to some extent ameliorating or reducing the risk of GVCs. The hidden plumbing of globalization, as I call it, is common technology standards, which directly affect at least 80% of international trade. And common standards reduce information asymmetries. They provide transparency, comparability, scale advantages, accountability, and a common technical language. So a lot of globalization is based on the hidden plumbing of universally accepted technical standards in thousands of sectors. I mean, these are just some examples, anything from smart buildings to food, horticulture, of course, financial transactions, and so on. Complete list would require thousands of pages. So we are building a global technological civilization based on cooperative activity, such as we see in this forum. And as part of that, greater cooperation and licensing and of intellectual property becomes an important issue. I've highlighted that as an area of research. And all three, it's worth saying that in the past 30, 40 years, all three methods of international business have grown at a faster rate than the average domestic GDP growth. So I know there are lots more conclusions, more slides, but I think I'd better stop here to allow a discussion and questions and answers. Okay,
thank you very much, Farooq. Thank you. I think that's a really nice list that you have there, and a nice addition to James's list. And I really liked in the beginning that you added up that you first started from the measurement issue, right? We had actually a good session as part of the World Investment Forum, a symposium on investment statistics, which covered a lot of ground also on FDI statistics, activities of multinationals, SDG investment monitoring on many different areas. So I think that's a very good point that must be central part of our research agenda going forward. I agree with you. I also like the different ways of looking at or the different internationalization modes, trade, investment, licensing. We had some analysis on that in WIR, looking at the growth of the different modalities by degree of tangibility, right? And so the intangible part is continuing to grow faster than the tangible part, with FDI being the most tangible one, of course. So very interesting. A few things I think we have come across over the years in WIR. So it will be very interesting to continue working on that. Before I pass on to the panel, I'd like to give our panelists the chance to ask a question. Just to raise a hand if you want to ask a question to Farouk now, or do that later. I don't see any hands now.
If not, I just have one comment. One important missing piece in a lot of research is the degree to which transactions are intra-firm or between unrelated parties. Because a lot of the statistics don't tell us, how much of the cross-border activity is between related parties versus unrelated parties. And that has an effect not only on tax issues, which are coming to the forefront, but also on strategy and government response.
I agree. We're actually wondering to what extent that will become clearer now with the more stringent reporting requirements for multinationals on the location of their value added and the location of their employees and assets. So maybe we'll get more insights into that in the coming years.
But one thing I've been missing in these questionnaires circulated to companies is the question of tick the box if this is a related transaction or an unrelated arm's length transaction. Such a question does not exist in any of the questions sent by governments to multinationals.
I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. We had a very interesting discussion on this in this week with our friend Lorraine Eden, also present in that meeting on the reform of international taxation. So this was clearly part of the agenda as well. Thanks, Farouk. You're going to stay with us, so perhaps we'll come back later with questions when our panelists become inspired.
Yeah.
But I think I'll move on, Farouk, and I'll do a quick introduction of our panelists, and then I'll just start with several rounds of questions. So just to give a quick overview for our audience, and I'll do it abbreviated because the audience can see all of you and your full credentials on our program. So I'll do it very quick. But we have Brooke Govan from Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, Columbia University. We have Ugo Panizza of the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies here in Geneva, an old friend. Xiaolan Fu of Oxford University, Jo Nojarko of New York University, Rob Gross, Thunderbird School of Management, Sarayana London of the University of Bremen, Jennifer Poole of the American University, and we have Heinz Tusselman of Manchester Metropolitan University, and of course, Deputy Editor of Transnational Corporations. So that's our group of panelists, and each of our distinguished panelists cover different topics. As I said earlier, we have international economic law, international economics, just looking very quickly, technology, development economics, all of it is of course international business. So I will just, I have a range of questions. I will start with the first round and address them to you specifically. I would ask you all to answer that initial question with about a 5-minute statement so that we keep time to come back to you and do several rounds of discussion. Yes? So my first question, I would like to ask Brooke Govan. It's about aligning cross-border investment with sustainable development objectives. Seems suitable for the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. So just a very broad question related to international economic law. And what's your perspective on the main research gaps in the area of reforming international investment law in line with the SDG agenda?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. And thanks for allowing me to kick off this promises to be a great panel. So as you mentioned, I'll talk about international investment law and bring in a fairly heavy policy perspective, I think, because this is in the midst of a lot of reform discussions that are quite relevant to discussions we've heard this week and to coming years. So there are many tensions right now that are widely recognized within the international investment law regime and other, sort of defined sustainable development objectives, whether identified in the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Agreement, which is obviously important coming up on COP. And we see these discussions playing out in a lot of different fora. Right now, for example, in the European Union with the Energy Charter Treaty reform, and in investment law more specifically, we see these discussions playing out in treaty reform. So almost no treaties, for example, mention climate. This is a glaring oversight in today's world when that is, if not the most existential crisis when we're talking about trying to achieve sustainable development as a whole. So there is a tension between how the investment treaty law regime has built up and what needs to be done to reform it and sort of where we're sitting right now. So there are various reform agendas, and I'd love to go into more in detail later as to, sort of academic research gaps and avenues that could be pursued here. But there are reform agendas that are occurring at bi-regional and multilateral levels that are trying to understand and address these gaps and tensions between investment law and other regimes. So some of these reform agendas are quite broad looking, thinking about how investment law could better support and align and be a tool for governments to use to achieve other goals. And some are really more focused on looking at the dispute settlement mechanism contained within the treaties, investor state dispute settlement, ISDS primarily. And that's really the most glaring way in which these tensions are coming to light. So on one end of the spectrum, we sort of see these national or regional decisions to simply exit. They're exiting treaties. We most recently Pakistan, before that it was Ecuador, South Africa, the entire European Union for intra-EU treaties. So we see the exit strategy happening. And we also see treaty reform occurring. So treaty reform is ranging from tweaking or adding, sort of new provisions to future treaties or amending or clarifying existing treaties in really a more tweaking sense. So adding, for example, more robust recognitions of right to regulate, carving out tobacco claims, or sort of reacting to problematic scenarios in which the investment law has been used. But it's really focused on sort of tweaks and keeping the system as it is today. I would also, to be controversial, throw the EU's proposed multinational investment court into this category, given that it deals with procedural matters, but doesn't really change the underlying substantive law. And the substantive law is what creates the incentives and obligations that are leading to many of these tensions. So there are other reform agendas that are happening beyond the sort of bilateral and regional ones. The biggest and most prominent is within, sister organization UNCITRAL's Working Group 3. And there's a high level of skepticism that this UNCITRAL process is going to achieve true reform, but I think the jury is still out. Because while it is focused on procedural matters, conflicts of interest, and other, kinds of issues, there are also these cross-cutting issues that have been put on the agenda primarily by developing countries that, if robustly addressed, I think really could get to the heart of some of these tensions. Those cross-cutting issues include dispute prevention, exhaustion of local remedies, a role for third parties. So communities, existing creditors, other kinds of parties that are not just the investor in the state. Investor obligations, so looking at this broader business and human rights framing, bringing that into this equation. Issues of regulatory chill, so not allowing treaties to prevent forward-looking regulation, or chill forward-looking regulation, I should say. And then damages. So I think, within UNCITRAL, if those kinds of issues, which are more the big picture reform and rethinking issues, are robustly addressed, I think we could start to see shifts in investment law that would align it, more concretely. Yeah.
I think this is a very nice overview of what's happening on the various reform agendas. Just very quick, some of these issues you will have heard at the IEA conference. And your first point, right, the glaring gap you mentioned of the climate change aspect. Just trying to move from reform agenda to research agenda for a second there, right? Did you take anything away from the IEA conference, for example, for future research on that aspect?
That conference, even though my colleague Lisa Sachs was able to join that one, I apologize, I was not, so I can't comment on that specific discussion.
Okay, because so we'll do a follow-up round, and I'd really like to take your thinking from the reform agenda to the research agenda to figure out what is it that we can work on in the future. But for now, I'm going to move on in our panel, if you don't mind, Brooke. I'm going to move to a completely different area of international economics. I'm going to move to Ugo Panizza. Ugo, cannot see you yet, but I'm sure you'll be there shortly. And hi. So for you, I'm just going to give you also a very general starting question for your first round. So in your view, what are the most promising investment strategies for developing economies for economic growth? So investment for development strategies, basically.
Okay, so there is there is a big disconnect between what we think on the link between FDI and growth and what the data seem to indicate. So I'm always a bit puzzled about this. So when we were colleagues at UNCTAD, we had this paragraph 166. I don't know if it still exists, but we would go to countries and talk with policymakers, and I would always start my class by asking people, so if you have the magic wand and you could have something to make your country better in terms of growth and competitiveness, whatever, what would you do? And the answer would always be, I would like to attract more FDIs. And so that was always the answer. So I could be in the Middle East, I could be in East Asia, I could be in Sub-Saharan Africa, I could be in Latin America, and that was the answer, the 90% would answer. And this is not just something from emerging and developing countries. Can I share 1 second? I just want to show 2 graphs.
Go ahead, Ugo.
Okay, share. Can you see?
Yes.
So this is not just emerging markets. So if we look at the European Commission, it says FDI is a key driver of competitiveness and economic development. So this idea that FDI is important, it's everywhere, and it seems right to me. The strange thing that when you look at aggregate data, it's hard to find this close connection between FDI and economic growth. So there are 2 very influential papers in this literature. So I have this paper, so one by Eduardo Borenstein and co-authors. This is a paper with 10,000 citations, which in economics is a lot. There's another paper by Laura Alfaro, which I think it was in the WIF recently, which also has a lot of citations, which find that FDI has no direct effect on growth, but it has an effect on growth with appropriate local conditions. Education in the case of paper of Eduardo and co-authors, and financial debt in the paper by Laura and co-authors. And so basically what they show is this. So FDI by itself, so this is the coefficient of a regression of FDI on growth. This is the point estimate, and this is the confidence interval. So you see sometimes negative, sometimes positive, not significant. These were papers which looked at the 1980-2000 period. But then when you would interact it with schooling, this is the paper by Edward and co-authors, or when you interacted with credit, this is the paper by Laura and co-authors, you find that the effect is large and positive. And so we were doing some growth, some work in trying to update this stuff. And then when you look at over time, things have changed. So there was a period in which actually FDI seemed to matter by themselves, but interacted with other things matter less, and then it went down. So for me, when I think about growth, and I'm gonna stop sharing this, when I think about the effects of FDI on growth, the big question is, why is this relationship so unstable in a sense? Why this relationship changes with time so much? What can explain this? Is the FDI that we measure have changed? So now we have more of like what we would call fake FDI, so just firms that pretend to produce out of a country just because of tax reasons. Is because the nature of FDI has changed. So I think that what you do at UNCTAD in your division by looking at much more granular data, because these are really broad regression in which we have total stock of FDI or total flows of FDI over growth, over GDP and then growth. This opens more questions that it kind of can address, because we have this strong prior, which I believe, which is sometimes not supported by the data, sometimes it is, and we don't understand why it is and why it's not. So in my sense, the frontier of research in this is really to look at granular data to understand the channels, and that's I think what you do, and what you have a strong comparative advantage in doing, also because this is demanding in terms of data and so on and so forth. But I'll stop here.
Thanks, Hugo. Yeah, this is we increasingly find ourselves having to look at more and more detailed data sets, complementary data sets, to try and really drill down to what's the most the part that affects most the competitiveness and productive capacity in developing countries. We had an interesting exercise just this year in the theme chapter of the World Investment Report, where we tried to relate the current trend in investment. I'm not saying FDI, and I'm saying investment, to the international or to the productive capacity index that we have developed in UNCTAD as well. So it really shows the type of it's one way of looking at possible priorities for steering investment, and it was really aimed at trying to find out this balance between attracting investment in industry versus attracting investment in infrastructure sectors. And where do I need, as a government, where do I need to put the priority? Where's the balance? So perhaps that's for the follow-up question, to really think about that, because that at this moment, with all of the money that's being poured from the public sector into infrastructure sectors in the post-COVID recovery, that's an interesting topic to discuss further. Thanks, Hugo, for that. Let me move on then. Let's think a little bit about technology now. And I'm going to move on to Professor Xiaolan Fu of Oxford University. And again, an opening question just to get you started, Xiaolan. So what are the investment policy gaps that you see that need to be filled to promote innovation and technology for sustainable development?
Thank you, Richard, for having me at this important event. Yeah, as you said, it is now widely recognized science, technology, and innovation can play a critical role in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and in tackling the global challenges. And the technology can contribute to sustainable development directly and indirectly. For example, if I look at this from the East Asia, digital technology can promote entrepreneurship and inclusive development in the base of the pyramid. And in Bangladesh, the ID model project that we carried out, implemented a short video app on mobile phone, and our research finds that households that used our app suffered less from economic hardship and has diversified their income resources and more information access. And in China, some large platform, multinational technology firms like Alibaba has this Taobao village, or some content-based new type of entrepreneur, content-based entrepreneurs arise based on TikTok or Kwai. So and also we see multinational firms during the pandemic provide online access to education, healthcare, and of course vaccine and the medicine to save lives. However, yes, a bottleneck for the developing countries is to facilitate and accelerate the technology transfer and the local technological capabilities in the developing country, and make sure they serve the purpose of sustainable development. And in this aspect, multinational firms, the foreign direct investment can serve as an effective vehicle. The theory suggests this, and also in fact, in China, we see China's catch-up in renewable energy. Many are led by joint ventures with multinationals. And also during the pandemic, how can we accelerate the global vaccine production? A paper that I did with Peter Buckley, which is forthcoming in GIBP, proposed that we should encourage international joint venture as a policy tool. However, like we have seen, the effectiveness of FDI in technology transfer is mixed. It's not and also not necessary aim for sustainable development. It's not necessarily a completely new area, but what's missing in our understanding and what's missing in investment and industrial policy, that's something we really need a new agenda to explore. So I have 6 suggestions. First is, how can we strengthen and accelerate technology transfer through FDI? How can we go beyond doing business as usual? I think that's the key. And also the developing countries have a lot of under the radar innovation. How can the multinationals help the developing countries combine the under the radar innovation with the digital windows of opportunity and create more sustainability enhancing innovation? And also by using, based on this digital windows of opportunity, how can multinationals help the developing countries deepen their participation in the global value chain based on this global public infrastructure? Secondly, what are the incentives for multinationals to invest in SDGs, and what policy incentives should be introduced? How can the multinationals achieve this? Actually, how can they achieve this? What I have found is partnership and co-production should be an area to emphasize in research. Because address global challenge, we need partnership. Technology transfer, especially building local capacity, need partnership and co-production. Thirdly, and also what is the role of the multinationals in digital platforms in this process? We see from Google to Facebook to Alibaba to TikTok, these platforms can provide useful infrastructures. They are multinationals. So what's their role and how we can encourage them to engage more sustainable development? Another area is development is very much centered about people. So in terms of international business research, more research on the micro foundation, bring down to the individual level is needed. Now we have a lot of firm level study or regional industrial level study, but looking at development, people-centered, I think is very important, and therefore the micro foundation is an area need to strengthen. And also in terms of ESGs and promoting sustainable development, is there any difference between the multinationals from the global north and the global south, and some deep understanding of this, and encourage them to promote more ESG oriented FDI will be another area. And finally, a question for me also echoes your questions. How shall knowledge in international business be integrated into policy making? Like our suggestion about using international joint venture to accelerate vaccine production. So this seems not a completely new area of research or knowledge. However, in terms of our response to the global pandemic, these two and this knowledge have not been, used as much as it can, has not fully kind of explore its potential. So in terms of policy making, maybe you and James can also give very good inputs in how the IB knowledge and skills can be integrated into the global policy in making process for sustainable development. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Kanan. Very interesting, your 6 questions. I'm a little bit, well, the first one I was a little bit unclear. I mean, the international joint ventures as a policy tool sounds extremely controversial to me, especially at this moment in time. So I'd be very interested in hearing, perhaps in the next round, what sort of research findings could change policymakers' minds on that, because at this moment they need the arguments to be convinced on if that should be a policy tool, right? It seems to be exactly the kind of thing that certainly Western policymakers would be not too happy about this idea. But interesting, thank you very much. I'd also like to know more about what is under the radar innovation. So we'll think about that as well. But I'm going to move on. Thanks for this technology perspective in this first round of discussion. And I will move on, and I come back to you later, Xalan. So I'm going to move on to Jone Jarko. So more of a development economics perspective, I think. And so it's focusing on a different region now, because Xalan talked very much about Asia. So if we think about Africa and Middle East, what are the opportunities and challenges in investing in economic transformation in the region? Sorry, I think you're muted, Jon.
I am muted. So I was just saying thank you. Great to be part of this panel. Big shout out to UNCTAD for the great work. And so I just wanted to, answer your question, let you know about Africa, technology, a few words around Charlene's remarks as well. But I'm going to focus on Africa, and also NYU Abu Dhabi are co-sponsoring this. So I'll also talk about the United Arab Emirates. And so a few quick remarks. My own work is with smallholder farmers in Africa. I do a lot of work in Ghana. And the first sort of intersection with technology, a few years ago, we constructed a commodity exchange, a national market for smallholder farmers. We're able to do that because the technological hurdles, we're able to surmount them right now. Okay, the technology is such that we can set up a national exchange, give mobile phones to farmers, get them interacting with each other. So technology on the ground, it's been great. We had, I think Richard, you had mentioned, the need for data. And so like Xiaolang, I'll also say that we need a lot of data. What I'd push for though, in terms of academic research, is we've done a lot of great work with cross-country regressions. We know a lot about the macro. It's time to focus on the micro, street level, what's going on. These big sort of figures, they just don't tell us what's happening on the ground. So if there's a push, that's what I would say. Let me mention the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. We're all extremely excited about that. And that's another opportunity for research. So African nations have decided to lower the constraints on working one country to another. It also means that foreign nations based in one country can, through that country, work in another country. So it's not only Africa to Africa trade that will be enhanced, but even all of FDI, because you can be headquartered in one country and then use that as a springboard to the other. And so, you know, a lot of research is going to be needed on that front. How does it help? Does it help at all? Digitization, technology is going to be important there as well, because if you're in one country, you don't have to physically go to the other country to do the trading, okay? So all those kinds of things are going to be important. Again, on the micro level, we need to be able to measure things like as simple as internet access. I am running what amounts to a small, an SME in Ghana. I'm currently speaking from New York. And simple things like being able to, you know, we're all on Zoom right now, and sometimes there are internet outages, there are electricity outages, and sometimes the macro would hide these issues, okay? And so those are the kinds of things, if you ask me what we need research on, those are the things that, you know, we need to get a handle on that, okay? Let me briefly talk about the United Arab Emirates. I remember maybe a decade ago, I wrote a paper for UN WIDER, and they were asking for development successes, which was, I think, a noble thing. We always talk about the tragedies of, you know, countries which are failing to grow. Let's look at some of them that have grown, okay? And I remember I was visiting the UAE at that time, and I said to the organizers, I think we need to talk about the United Arab Emirates as a development success, okay? Here's a country that, you know, up until maybe 1974, you know, they were not independent. They were a British, essentially a British colony. Most of the place was full of desert. You go there right now, we all know the stereotypical Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and all the skyscrapers. All of this has been since 1974. And so there too, we need to think about how did they do it, okay? And a lot of it was technology-based, logistics-based, shipping-based, okay? If you look at the Comtrade data, you will see a lot of exports out of the UAE, but those are all re-exports, okay? So countries take their goods from one place, they put it in the ports in the UAE, Dubai, and then transship it somewhere else, okay? And all of that is possible because of logistics, etc. So that's another area that I think research we need to talk about. On the Africa side, trade between countries. The data is very, very poor. And so if you ask me where the research needs to go, I'd put that there. And then finally, another part of the research, which I think is extremely important, is measuring attitudes of people, the people on the ground, to all of these things we're saying today. FDI and trade, we all, as economists, as researchers, as academics, it's sort of instinctive to us that it's good. The man and woman on the street, however, they could lose their jobs when there's free trade, okay? So we know that free trade is always beneficial on aggregate, but none of our theories tell us that, you know, everybody is going to be improved. We all know that some will lose, some will gain. The gain will be better than the loss. That's what we teach our undergraduate students. That's what's in our brains. But on the ground, if you're somebody who's going to lose, it's going to hurt, okay? And we need to get buy-in on the ground for all of these things we're talking about in this session. A big shout out to Afrobarometer. They do a lot of work on surveys, on people's attitudes. They are working primarily on the political front. In terms of data, we need to ask organizations like that, what are your attitudes to foreign trade? What are your attitudes to industrialization? What are your attitudes to multinational companies coming in? The UAE was a big success because as they were bringing in international development, they had on their books ways in which there's co-ownership of firms. And so the people of the UAE, the nationals, benefited as trade was going up, as development was happening, okay? And so that's why they were able to get the buy-in. So if you asked me another area that we need to talk about, it would be people's attitudes, okay? That should go in the equations, and Afrobarometer, they're good at that. And then finally, another area of research I think is very important is, as we're bringing in foreign direct investment, how much of that is spilling over to the economy as a whole, right? So when you bring in one company, what are the spillovers in creation of other companies, or in training people who can then use that those skills to start their own new companies. So we sort of know how to do it. I don't think any part of the literature is being given the boost to measure those things. I think it's extremely important. And that would be another area that I would say, if you ask me where the literature should go, that's another area. So let me pause there. I think I've taken a little bit more than 5 minutes, but forgive me for that.
No, it's fine, Yo. I think you were quite close, so no worries. And you touched on a couple of really interesting points there. Certainly the AFCFTA is of course leading to an enormous amount of new work on intra-regional trade and investment, and on the regional FDI effect. I mean, this has been a pet topic of ours for quite a long time, and always had, of course, the data difficulty of not being able to measure intra-regional FDI very well. We've made some progress in that in the last few years, also trying to come up with ultimate ownership and ultimate destination data to try and get a better picture of what's really happening in terms of investment flows. But yeah, it's certainly a topic that should be high on the agenda, and it's also sparked a bunch of other topics, because if you think about what will generate the intra-regional FDI on the continent in Africa, it's going to have a fairly high propensity of SMEs in that compared to elsewhere. So that's why sort of the research angle of SME internationalization is also very interesting. So thank you for that one. And I liked the idea of looking at development successes and what we can learn from them. And I was fascinated by the idea of the attitudes to people on the ground, because of course you see that a lot on trade, right? I think everyone has done that, or everyone has done that in the sense that we know the backlash against trade emerged from that, right? But I'm not sure if the same has been done yet for investment, right? The attitude of people on the ground on foreign investment coming in. We probably know what is the attitude of investment going out, but coming back in or coming in, I don't know. So it's a very interesting point. Thank you for that. We'll come back to you, Yo.
Sounds good.
So I move on to Rob Gross. And we've had the focus on Asia. We've had the focus just now with Yo on Africa and Middle East. And you're going to look a little bit more at Latin America. And your overview question is related to the SDGs. What contribution can investment make to achieving the SDGs in the region?
Thank you, Richard. And I'm very happy to be part of the forum. When we got involved at AIB in putting together the set of sessions, along with Ari and Sariana and a few others, and Heinz, I participated in that effort, and I understood I was going to talk about the future of research on international investment and production in this session. So I was surprised yesterday to find out I'm talking about Latin America, which is my region of most emphasis, and I will tailor my 4 points to Latin America, but I just have 4 points to make. Number one, I think we should note that international investment is taking place by funds and conglomerates, as well as by industry-focused multinationals. Funds are financial entities that don't necessarily have industry-specific knowledge, like conglomerates. I think of Berkshire Hathaway under Warren Buffett. He hires people who know what they're doing in the different businesses, but they're more or less totally unrelated. Or in the Tata Group, or Jardine Matheson, and many others. And in Latin America, the FEMSA Group in Mexico, which is in beer and Coca-Cola and convenience stores, and Grupo Itaú in Brazil, in 5 or 6 different industries. The Luxich Group in Chile, which is in half a dozen industries, and they change all the time. Most commonly, these investors in companies other than the conglomerates buy small amounts of shares or bonds, and they don't take controlling interest. But the funds are major investors in international investment these days that we should pay more attention to. A lot of times the funds are owned by governments and pools of investors, the sovereign wealth funds in particular, and these are different from traditional multinationals. So what does it say about governance? Rules at the level of the World Trade Organization or IMF are needed to limit government non-economic decisions of these MNEs or at least to agree on what the government's role should be. Fund managers tend to be very focused on financial returns and not on SDGs, so government oversight is needed. And the research in this area is needed on both management and regulation of these fund investors. As with my other themes that I'll mention now, there's also some research in our literature, but a lot more is needed to understand these new types of investors who control FDI as well as portfolio investment. Second point is that international production controlled by companies will continue to parcel out business activities to different countries. The key challenge is that that technology is replacing people. So offshore assembly and business process outsourcing may lose their appeal in favor of machines and software, which certainly hurts countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and basically those regions. This is relevant worldwide, not just in the Asian region, as Xiaolen was talking about, but obviously in Latin America and Africa as well. It's a huge challenge to governments. Farouk and Sariana are talking about global value chains, and those will be greatly affected by this technology challenge. Research is needed to know how business is changing and also on company worker relations. But this technology theme is really outside of IB directly, let's say. We need further exploration of the impacts of the pandemic on international business and on company strategies to manage the risks involved. And that's particularly relevant here and in Latin America in specific. I think risk management is an approach that can be applied to the international business phenomena that we're talking about, rather than emphasizing this word resilience. It's not that they're different, but risk management's been around for a long time, and it offers a lot of guidelines or guidance for us. Third of 4 points is the transition that we're encountering to a dual hegemonic and hopefully stable world, with China and the United States leading in terms of direct investment, trade, technology development, management skills, and political power. This is producing a new world order. It doesn't have to result in a war, as some previous hegemonic transitions have done, but the conflict between these two hegemons will continue as China becomes economically larger and more powerful and recruits more countries into its sphere of influence. Research is needed to explore the implications of this dual hegemony for multinational firms, for countries, and for business in general. This is prime territory for UNCTAD's Transnational Corporations Journal and AIB's Journal of International Business Policy, and it's an underexplored area thus far. And my final point, with respect to Latin America and the Caribbean, conceptually, there are no compelling models of business analysis different from those originating in the triad, despite Latin America being a region of emerging markets. Most countries remain in the shadow of the United States, although both Brazil and Argentina have the size and capabilities to become more global players in GVCs, given their fairly similar distance from the US and Europe and China. There's a great emphasis on entrepreneurship in Latin America and the Caribbean, I think more than in the triad countries. So research on extending entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial companies internationally, from startups to long-established family businesses, would be welcome in the Latin American region. If you look at the business journals in Spanish and Portuguese in the region, there's much greater emphasis on entrepreneurial businesses than what you find in the US and Western Europe journals, ones that are based in those countries. Research is needed to guide countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to build their business systems. Participation in value chains is very valuable, but the challenge of economic and social inequality is a huge threat to stability in the region, from Guatemala to Venezuela to Argentina and other countries in between. Research is also needed to guide companies to become regional giants, since the opportunity is there. At the micro level, we need some focus, as you all mentioned a few minutes ago. Technology is a key challenge, given that the persistent high levels of unemployment in the region are a reality, and the tendency of technology to replace people with machines is quite a sticky wicket. So I hope these thoughts are useful to our thinking about multinational firms, government policy, and the challenges of the new post-COVID environment in this dual hegemonic world. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate those points there. I like that first point you were talking about very much. I mean, we have well, over the years already also looked at, well, you called it yourself, new types of investors is the words you used, and I think we did the same some time ago. And it's really amazing how, for example, private equity is becoming ever more important in international investment flows. And of course, it behaves quite differently from your traditional multinational enterprise. That's the sort of the mainstay of studying and research in IB, for example. So I think really worth extending that and looking at these new types of investors. So that's a very good point. Yeah, I got your other ones to the last one on the sort of the more entrepreneurial nature of business in Latin America is an interesting point. We do a lot of work there also because, as you know, our division is investment and enterprise. We have an entrepreneurship section. We do a lot of work in Brazil, and it's definitely interesting to explore there the idea of what you can do to guide small companies to become regional giants. It's a nice expression. I think that's worth exploring. Thanks for that, Rob, for those ideas. Appreciate it. I move on to my next panelist, and that's going to be Sariana London. And we're going to look at the role of FDI in the energy transition. So I have a question here for you. What specific investment policy and practical measures are needed to remove barriers and facilitate the energy transition? Sariana, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So you know yourself, because you were chairing the session yesterday.
Yes.
On project finance, so we have a little bit of sort of common interest here. But I would start with two themes that Farouk had in his very nice beginning talk. So M&Es and technology transfer and demonstration effects. So we're interested in M&Es because they are vehicles for technology transfer. And on the other hand, we know that there are these demonstration effects. Demonstration effects can be that local firms are learning through observation and other means, things that are important for the development of their business. But there's a second dimension to it if you make it a little bit broader, and this is this follow my leader behavior. So we know from past research that investment tends to bunch. So once there is a successful investor in one place, it tends to invite, it's a signaling effect, it gives information, it tells the other investors, okay, that this is an okay place to go. And what was very apparent in this session that both of us attended was that in order to facilitate and accelerate the technology transfer that other people have already talked about, we would need quite strong demonstration effects. We would need to somehow accelerate this follow my leader effect. And I don't think that we have really studied it. I would also call for us to go back to the industry level, really do focus studies. I think the two industries that are obvious are solar and wind. These are two industries where the technology is cost competitive. It's ready to go. There is a tremendous demand. There is a tremendous amount of public money that is actually available for these kinds of investments. And yet we have concerns about whether sufficient quantities of investment are going to be mobilized in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. I mean, just to give you an example, but the Indian policy of the Modi government is to go from 100 gigawatts of installed capacity of renewables to 450 by 2030. So they have 9 years to do this. That means they have to at least quadruple the amount of foreign investment coming into the country. I hope that can be done. I believe that can be done. India is in a fairly strong position in that industry, but it's by no means obvious. And yet all of us understand what the implications are, whether India makes it through that transition or whether it doesn't. And of course, we can then extend it to the whole rest of the world. So I really think that studying this sort of industry level, follow my leader, what gets the first investor to commit to that location, to those projects, and does it invite further investment? I think is quite important, because the unique thing at this moment is the temporal pressure, is the idea that we are all on a clock. that's running down. And I think it creates slightly bizarre effects in the global economy because everyone is now moving to electrify their power grids, their power systems. So it means that there's a tremendous need that is simultaneous around the world for this type of investment. And I think, I mean, Richard, we have talked about this before. I think it can lead to a kind of a capacity crunch. Do we really have enough firms that will sort of, is the supply so elastic that we will have all these firms coming up? But even if not, then it's even more important to know, how do we mobilize them, and can we get some of this follow my leader behavior? Because I think that's necessary for developing countries to really leapfrog in the energy transition. I think there are possibilities for them to leapfrog, but that's only if this investment can be mobilized in a short period of time. The second point I want to make, because that was all IB. I think the IB community really, hopefully, will engage with these issues on an industry level. The second, I would kind of throw away, to throw over the fence to our colleagues in finance, because it seems, not only from what I heard here, but what I've heard elsewhere, is that there's a couple of really old themes that are still getting in the way: currency risk and counterparty risk. I'm pretty sure that with everything that's going on in fintech, should there not be possibilities to come up with ways to structure the financing for these deals in such a way that we could overcome some of this risk? I mean, local lending in the local currency is, of course, one way to avoid that risk. But I think not all capital markets are developed enough for that. The capacity may not be there. But surely, on the finance side, there could be people thinking about how to structure the financing in such a way that that risk is less. The second, the counterparty risk, I'm learning more and more about these problems. So this is governments basically, because these infrastructure investments have a long payback period, governments have a tendency to sort of renege at some point. They fail to make payments, or the government-owned utilities fail to make payments. Again, I think this is something that, and I learned this from the session here at WIF. So the EBRD, for instance, is doing a lot of training. They're doing a lot of capacity building, just like UNCTAD is doing, to really make sure that the first deal that gets off the ground is well structured, so that we wouldn't run into this situation where payments are not being made, because the demonstration effects go both ways. The negative ones seem to have a very chilling impact. And my final word on that would be, it was a different, wasn't at the WIF, but someone said that investment is like water. And I really think that's true. So it flows where it's the easiest way to go. You put obstacles in the way and it will just find its way around. And somehow we have to get water to be a little bit more robust and resilient. In other words, we have to get investors to engage with these risks maybe a little bit more willingly, but also we have to try to make sure that there are as few obstacles as possible, because I think at the end of the day, if there are other easier opportunities, that's where the money is going to go. So those are a few of my thoughts, and thank you for having me. I really enjoyed yesterday. It was a really very informative day. So
great. Thanks, Ariana. Thank you. Yeah, and we have talked about this before, and this is one of my pet topics. So I'm really, we discussed before. I'm quite keen for research in our area to really look much more closely at international project finance, at sort of shifting this sort of traditional sort of 80-20 balance in terms of 80% looking at investment in global value chains, supply chains, multinational enterprises in industry, and only 20% of research looking at project finance in infrastructure. I would like to shift it more to at least come closer to 50-50, right? I mean, if we launched on Monday, on the first day of WIF, the Global Investment Trends Monitor. And if you look closely at the data, we look at greenfield investment, which is mostly industry, and project finance, which is mostly infrastructure. And in the last few years, they were sort of ballpark in the same range. Greenfield was still a little bit bigger. And it looks now this year, at the way things stand now, that with Greenfield still on a downward path and international project finance booming because of all these recovery funds being invested, that international project finance is going to far exceed a Greenfield investment. And sort of drawing on my proxies, that means infrastructure investment far exceeds industry investment. And that means that our research should really take note of that. We should look at the behavior of what Rob also said, right? These new types of investors that we haven't looked at enough, because yeah, these are very different types of investors investing in infrastructure and renewable energy, which is the biggest sector currently of the infrastructure part. So it really links well what Rob also said earlier in terms of paying closer attention in our research agenda to new types of investors. So thank you for that. You also pointed at this capacity problem that we discussed, and the Indian example of needing to quadruple FDI. You just, I'm going to make you an exception. I'll ask you a question right away. I mean, why did you say they have to quadruple FDI rather than just quadruple investment?
Quadruple, so simply just to reach the number. So they are at 100 gigawatts today. They need to get to 450 in 9 years. Okay. At the moment, it's about 10 gigawatts a year that they're getting in foreign investment. So if the proportions stay roughly the same, they should be getting 4 times more per year. In other words, they need 40 gigawatts in order to
very, very clear, but it doesn't necessarily have to be foreign, right?
It doesn't have to be foreign. It can also be domestic, absolutely.
Now we had the same thought even on the global number, right? So over the last 10 years, infrastructure investment globally has never grown faster than 7% on an annual basis. That was the fastest rate of growth achieved in 1 year. And we now have an implied rate of growth for the next couple of years of above 20% worldwide. So yeah, that's going to be very difficult to implement. Okay, we will come back to you, Sarjana. So thank you for that contribution. I'm fully with you on the research priorities there.
Yeah, this is a little bit preaching to the choir because we have talked about this before, but
okay, I'm moving on to Jennifer. We have also done work together recently in the field of gender equality. So Jennifer, your question. So what policies can home countries of investors adopt to better motivate multinational enterprises to export good practices towards gender equality?
Well, thanks, Richard. Wonderful question. Let me also thank Amelia and Claudia, and of course you, for our previous work together. I had been told earlier that I should talk about sort of areas for future research in this topic of FDI and gender. I think one of my areas for future research touches a bit on your direct question, Richard. So let me punt that to my number 3. I've thought about 4 broad areas that I think we can, as a community, as researchers and policymakers, hope to move this idea forward. So Richard alluded to some earlier work we've done together. Actually, it was roughly a year ago, last International Women's Day, launching the implications of foreign investment on women, women empowerment. And I know that was a session earlier this week that I unfortunately could not attend because I was meeting with the WTO chief economist. And the good news there is that, at least for me, I was happy to hear that the World Trade Organization is also moving beyond what I think of as sort of very narrow goods trade and thinking about issues of gender and thinking about the role of investment. And so if I think about these areas for future research, using that project as guidance for the role of foreign direct investment in promoting female empowerment, I'm thinking about it in sort of 4 buckets. The first is mechanisms. The second having to do with data. So I probably will echo some of what my colleagues here on the panel have said, but hopefully there will be some value added. And then regulations. So this touches very carefully, I think, closely to what Richard alluded to in his question. And then finally, let's think about other measures of female empowerment as we move forward in research. So the first being mechanisms. In our report, to address something that Professor Narco had mentioned, we very carefully, I think, tried to address using micro data for foreign investment and workers and people on the ground, to think about the potential mechanisms of how foreign investment would actually begin to benefit women. So on this point, partly it's a theoretical approach, right? What was the overarching answer for our report? Yes, FDI can be beneficial to women sometimes, but not all the time. It is certainly not automatic. And in part, this is what Hugo was also referring to. We need, absolutely, I'm going to make an emphatic plea that we maintain objectivity in our research. We know what we want to find. Ideally, we would find that FDI can promote female empowerment around the world, or growth, or other measures of CSR standards. But we also should remain objective and look at the data as it tells us. So either our priors might be wrong, or maybe we're looking at the question a little bit wrong. I'm sure both are probably true. So on the mechanisms, we explored labor mobility, we explored supply chains, we explored technology. I think there are several others that we can be exploring that, to my knowledge, have not yet been explored. Importantly, I think Farouk mentioned management practices, the ways in which multinational firms can bring with them better, more efficient other management practices that might have these gender-specific policies embedded in them to promote gender equality. Exports, this is a place where we can have great policy coordination and interaction along research lines with the World Trade Organization and the World Bank on these ideas. Yes, multinationals might bring with them knowledge of different, better export markets that may have products that we know better utilize female employment. So thinking about the mechanisms, really going back a step, I suppose, to thinking through the theory of why we should expect an impact of foreign investment on women in particular. The second is data, and I probably won't spend much time because many of my colleagues on this call have already addressed that. Yes, it needs to be micro. As an outside researcher, I was already somewhat surprised, working with UNCTAD, that the data on country of origin specific, sector specific data on foreign investment was quite limited and difficult to access. We need this deeper data, and as Farouk said, intra-firm relative to third party. I might argue that it's not just FDI, it's also the gender statistics. I think we cannot rely on self-reporting. I have a different viewpoint, I suppose, than others who want to understand individuals' attitudes. I think we need very objective measures and not measures that can be somewhat wishy-washy and subjective. I don't know what a 5 necessarily on a attitude scale means. So sometimes we need to think about, if a company is reporting a gender wage gap of 80, what exactly does that mean? And so moving on beyond data, the third is, I guess, addressing Richard's question most directly, and that has to do with regulations. We have to be careful. Much of my research is on the implications of local labor regulations and how those interfere sometimes with globalization and the potential benefits from. I think we need to be very careful about placing too many regulations. We know that can be very stifling from the business perspective. In times where we want to encourage female employment, we may be counter-effective in actually discouraging the employment of women if those women workers become relatively expensive to hire because of the regulations imposed on companies to hire them. So this is both a international regulations and then also local labor regulations. Of course, by no means should we suggest zero regulations. Workers need employment protections. Workers need to feel secure in their jobs. This goes for men and women equally. But we need to, and I would like to think that a great research agenda going forward is really finding that balance in some ways, like the optimal tariff or an optimal tax rate. What is the right, I don't know, what is a good level of regulatory to encourage, as Richard pointed out, companies to help transfer their appropriate gender policies, but what might be stifling on the other And then finally, I'll just address that if the role and if we're thinking about women empowerment, we need to begin to go beyond just our typical labor market outcomes that we think about, wages and employment. Women are impacted by marriage markets, crime, and there are several papers along these lines that I think exploring the other ways in which women might be impacted, largely through income effects related to foreign investment. This is another, I think, fruitful line of research moving forward. And I will just conclude by saying that we as policymakers and academics together need to recognize that this is not a always good thing or always bad thing. And that research can be finding what are the policies and what are the tools in order to benefit from when FDI can certainly contribute to gender equality. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and happy to hear that our colleagues in WTO have probably read what we have done and thinking about copying something similar or doing something similar with you. But it's also good to know that there is still a future agenda out there on the issue of the impact of FDI on gender equality. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to pass on to Heinz Tusselman, but before I do that, I'm just going to alert all the panelists that I'm going to give you an opportunity after this round to ask each other questions, right? So I'm sure you've heard from your colleagues things that you found interesting as a potential research avenue. So please think of a question to ask one of our colleagues around the table, and if possible, interdisciplinary. That would be great. Okay, let me move on to our last panelist, Heinz. And having discovered that basically we're all prepared to just address the future research agenda, which is ideal, of course, I'm just not going to ask you a very specific question, Heinz. The relevance of IB research in shaping international policy making. What do we have to do?
Well, Richard, thank you very much for having me there. Well, I would basically say, look, going back to the early days of IB research, and this is very well known to my colleagues, we have had quite a lot of impact in UNCTAD, in international organization, and in national government concerning policies for investment multinationals by very much tackling what's called real-world issues arising from empirical observations and development in the world economy. And we are all very well aware, and it's very healthy, that from time to time we reflect and criticize basically ourselves, asking questions: how relevant is our work actually for policymakers in tackling the big issues and so on? And we all know about the well-known blockbusters from Peter Buck and Jonathan Doe, the grand challenges that also AIB Insights in the last decade, there was a lot of criticism. So basically, and also a lot of prescriptions, which we all know. My view is, look, some of them we have to take on the chin, but others I have to say, look, we haven't stood still in international business and beyond. So criticism like that, we don't address real world issues, but just look at the importance of phenomena-based perspectives in our research, that we are to narrow silos, that we are not interdisciplinary enough. And I think Farouk pointed out quite rightly, by the very nature, IB is interdisciplinary, but perhaps we should move outside our comfort zones more, not just to the aligned disciplines, but look things like the current pandemic, also connecting to other disciplines like health, to the health economists, what have you. Another big issue is, and that came several times, is, or criticism was, that we too much concerned about the micro level. But I think, and this has been said in this panel a few times, and I think Peter Buckley also pointed that out in the opening panel, look, actually, we need these very micro level insights, you know, about complexes in decision-making processes within global value chains, complex internationalization processes within the multinational, in order for policymakers to have a good understanding of it and to avoid naive policymaking. Yeah? And I think a big criticism has always been, yes, we are too particular by our core and top journals, too driven by theory development, theory testing, methodological advancements and so on, and very limited to an academic audience, and that we are light on policy substance, context, and so on. I would say yes, but is this not basically the core job of our top journals and our core journals to advance theory, to advance methodology for the well-being of our subject area and our discipline, now to have a voice, and also that we do not engage enough in policy issues, because of course it means that requires quite substantial investment on side of the researchers into policy substance, working out the policy space, the interconnections, interdependencies with other related policy areas, policy coherence. How does it fit within the overall development objectives of countries or the competitiveness strategies, what have you? And my view is, but you might disagree, basically is, look, if we are asking, do we ask too much of our top and core journals here? In the end of the day, their core business is theory development, methodological advances. Of course, and I have seen, we have become more interdisciplinary there. We are looking at real world problems from an academic and empirical lens, what have you. But are we now also saying we must become heavy on policy substance? Or would we then not become a jack of all trades and master of none? But of course, my view is, look, there are different horses for different courses here. For example, now is the time to move to the next frontier in our work, in particular, our journal landscape. So look, we do have two very good policy journals in our area. Journal of International Business Policy, 2018 established. Transnational Cooperation successfully reformed and repositioned, 2018. So basically the idea is, for me, is, look, what we need to do now, and this is a very heartfelt call to all of you out there, look, we have managed, so a lot of energy, time, diplomacy, to upgrade our journals in the last particular journal ranking list, like the Charter's ABS list. Now is the time to put our best foot forward for our policy-orientated journals to move up the rankings and become firmly established core journals in our discipline. And this is my heartfelt plea to all you thought leaders out there, you eminent scholars, is, look, put your best foot forward, submit your best policy-orientated research to our policy journals. Do guide and support your early career researchers to put their best policy or engaged research to our journals so that we can move up in the all-important journal ranking lists. And we mustn't forget, we do still live in a time of publish or perish, where there is a certain number of journals that are, called 3-4-star journals particularly, and of course the intergalactic journals, our world elite journals. But at the same time, as we know, there is increasing pressure from civil society, from policy, from funding bodies, from research assessment bodies to put extra value on the impact of our research on society, practice, and policy making. Basically, and look at the UK research assessment exercise, huge premium on impact. Look, for example, funding, EU Horizon. If it ain't impact, it's not done. So therefore, my point to you is, let's square the circle here. Let's put our best foot forward, put our best work to our policy-orientated journals as well, so that they can become one of our core journals and not just an add-on.
Thanks, Heinz.
That's all we have time for.
Yeah. Here. I couldn't have said it any better, and I'm sure Seriana will agree with you as well. So thanks for that call. I think it's a very good point, and I think to note is, if I go back and think about the questions that James put in the beginning of the session and at the beginning of the opening session, what he did was he actually put there the big policy concerns, right? And it's sometimes really hard to translate that into, what is the specific, and you're talking IB, so I'll repeat IB, what's the specific IB area that I would start researching to answer that question? But vice versa, the problem for us in UNCTAD is of course the same, right? We look at some maybe idiosyncratic topics being researched in IB, and then figuring out what's the policy conclusion from that can also be hard. So marrying the two, I definitely agree, and we do our best in the TNC journal with your help to make sure that the papers in there are reflected in our policy work, policy advice, WIRs, etc. I'm going to go back to our round now. We have half an hour left, so I have to be a little bit disciplined here now. I haven't been so far, apparently. And I'm going to go back to Brooke, if you don't mind, Brooke. I gave you a question already, I think, when we left off. So I'm going to give you the choice. My question at the time, I think, was, what is the research agenda now, for example, with the missing climate change aspects in international investment law? What does that mean for our research agenda? And if you want to conclude, you're allowed to ask a question to someone else.
Sure. So on climate in particular, I think there's a few different things that go toward the broader research agenda. I think, and I'm going to throw this out there, but I think if, 3 certain issues could be addressed in ISDS, it would go a long way toward addressing the climate issue. The first is damages. So on climate, a lot of work is being done on what is fair market value and what methodologies are appropriate. So should we be using a social cost of carbon? How do we price in shocks and volatility? How do we price in stranded asset risk? These are all areas, in other disciplines that are being very well developed, less so in international investment law, and need to be integrated in order to address this climate challenge. The second, I would say, would be requiring exhaustion of local remedies. We saw, recently the Netherlands and Shell, a great case coming out where they were looking at sort of the business and human rights obligations of an oil company. And what does that mean for the climate impact that this company is having on citizens? If we could get local courts, local communities, and people more involved in domestic processes to hammer out these issues, rather than bypassing those, I think that would be a great addition. So how do we do that in investment law? What reform agendas are necessary to integrate both these damages questions and exhaustion of local remedies, and then shareholder claims as well? Yeah.
Brooke, I think the second point sounded to me more like the sort of a cross between research bar reform agenda. The first point is a very interesting research agenda item there. And on top of that, an interdisciplinary research agenda item. So I really like that one. The sort of and how do you price these type of damages that emerge with climate change related damages? So very interesting one. Do you want to ask a question to someone else that came up in your while you were listening, or shall I move on?
Yeah, no, I think one actually, if I could with Jennifer, I was following closely the issue of gender and the other issues she was raising, and the positive versus negative impacts. One thing we've also been looking at in investment law is the role of impact assessments, both ex ante and ongoing. So I'm just wondering if she has any insights into successful ways in which trade and investment impact assessments could, address many of these different issues. And if not, I welcome you to ask her a question as well.
Okay, Jennifer, can you answer in 1 minute?
In the sense of impact assessments, I'm not sure I'm even aware of exactly what you mean, meaning countries are going in and looking at what is an impact assessment here in your mind?
I was thinking of trade agreement impact assessments. You were talking about sort of WTO matters and gender issues. As they relate to
So
investment.
I come at this from much more the research perspective, but I spent a year in the Obama administration really, trying at the time to get TPP moving forward and thinking about what roles do gender and in fact also the environment and small businesses and technology play in our trade agreements now. I am less on the legal side, and I'm not sure I could speak directly to what the agreements can do. In my mind, from an academic point of view, again, we get into this difficult area of when you regulate something, it potentially imposes a barrier that distorts what might otherwise be positive implications of foreign investment and trade more generally. I guess I approach things slightly differently in that I would, again, coming from an objective stance, like to have us say, there's not automatically going to be a positive that we want to transfer. Let's at best try to get no negatives if that can make sense. Leave it there.
Jennifer. That's great, and I think you have a lot more to talk about together. So I think we should probably follow up on this after the session. Do you have a question for someone else, Jennifer?
Sure, absolutely. Well, maybe I'll just ask it more generally to the group, but I suppose it connects most carefully with what Ugo and Ya were mentioning, in that, suppose we do see, and I am asking this because it's very close to home, that there are not always these positive effects on growth, for example, or on more generally development and inequality and all of the outcomes that we care about. How do we as policymakers then approach that? Not to change the policies necessarily, but how do we then address that? I hope the answer is not stop flows of investment. I guess that's where I'm coming.
Ugo or Yo, would you like to step in on this?
Yeah, so Jennifer, that's an excellent question. And I love the way you mentioned earlier on that we should be honest with our research, that there are certain goals we may want to obtain, but just may not be there. In particular, so to address exactly what you said, sometimes some FDI flows into developing countries, they're good in terms of the statistics, but the impact on the ground is negligible, if not negative. That's a fact. We've seen them, we know them, governments know them. Sometimes they're pressurized to have the foreign companies come in. We know all that story. About 50, 60 years ago, there was militant left-wing groups in forums like this that were saying these things much more loudly than we are right now. That doesn't mean, however, that we shouldn't have FDI. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have the MNEs. It just means that, look, there's some things that are bad about it, and let's have a conversation. For example, I'm a big believer in transferring skills, okay? So in the African context, China, for example, is doing a lot of infrastructure investment. Wouldn't it be great if, as this huge amount of investment was coming in, we were also training local companies so that when the Chinese leave, we've established some local engineering firms that can also build roads, right? So little things like that, if you bring it into the policy mix, okay, and we measure all of those things, you can see that you can have your cake and eat it. You can have the FDI because it's needed, you need the capital, and also measure an impact on the ground. These are simple things which, again, asking for micro data, you don't see that in the macro data. You don't see that in cross-country regressions, okay? And they're just things on the ground where you just look at it, they're building a road and they bring all the high-skilled labor from China, and you see them manning all of these big machines. What are the Africans doing then, okay?
Yeah.
And so these are things, yeah, anyway, that's my answer to you. Sorry for—
No, but it's a good answer, and I think it strengthens your earlier point also about the greater need for micro analysis on this, on the impact. So it's really good. And I'm not going to give you a chance now to ask another question, because I have a couple of hands that have been raised, and the first was Hugo's.
So I'm going to answer Jennifer's question, which is basically repeating what it was just said by you. But also, I also, you have my strategy. I also wanted to ask a question to the whole group. And so the answer is exactly this, that if we see bad things, then we need to understand what drives these bad things. And in order to understand what drives these bad things, we need to have detailed data. So that's what you just said. That's it. There is a more general issue, which is important for researchers. So we all agree here that to do research, we need more granular data. We need, all this stuff. Now, this stuff, getting access to granular data is difficult. In most cases, it's expensive. Only people with big research budget can, buy this data set, which have this thing. And it's also expensive because this data come and they're messy. You need to clean them. So you need research assistants and all this stuff. So one thing that it worries me, and this is really happening in economics. So economic research is moving more to the lab model. So, before you had people writing a paper, and now you have, Rai Chetty, we are just, 50 people working for him. So this is gonna create inequality it's gonna deepen inequality in the research process. So people who are based in universities, which are rich, which can afford, which afford buying large data set, which have large budget, which allow people to hire a lot of research assistants, are going to become even better and more productive researcher. And people who are sitting in small universities with small budget, who cannot afford, which have poor library, which cannot afford to hire army research assistant, are going to face a difficulty. And I think one thing that international institutions, and I'll say UNCTAD because we're talking with UNCTAD, but that's the same thing that the IMF and the World Bank could do, is could, number one, accumulate this data and then make calls and give, researchers from, small universities who don't have budget, the opportunity to work with them and use this data and leverage this data. And I think, so that's a statement, but it's also a question, is whether you think it's indeed a problem and how you would solve this problem.
Thank you very much for that, Hugo. And you have all now put me in difficulty here because I have 4 other people who would like to speak, and I do not have much space anymore. But I'm going to, Sariana was the first, so I'll pass the floor to Sariana. Then I would like, if you can be brief, I would like to give the floor back to Farouk just for some remarks. I will not cut off our discussion, but for our outside audience, it will be cut off at past. So I just want to make sure that we have a few final words, and I will conclude then, and we can continue our discussion. So Sariana, briefly, please.
Yeah, just 2 very brief comments. One actually on Hugo's comment, where I just really want to sort of pass it back to you, Richard, and say I think UNCTAD and other institutions have a role here, because although we are pursuing open science in some parts of the social sciences, that's not uniform. And in management and business, it's only beginning. So we're talking about data repositories where you publish your data along with your study, and then you have a DOI that links to the data. So it's kind of forever associated with you, or pre-publishing. I think these are really important issues that Hugo raised, and I think the international institutions have a role to play there. My original question, and I will maybe only throw it out there, but I also had a question for Jennifer, because I was very interested in, obviously, in the research, and I don't know that much about it. I was wondering about, is there any sense of how much of the impact is intentional versus unintentional? And what I mean by that is, we talk about it, Amelia put the link to the report, I will look at that, but those are intentional, that's transfer of policies, transfer of practices, and how that has an impact on the ground. But then, of course, we know that multinationals are very skewed in the skill categories that they employ. They may be skewed in terms of the gender that is then associated with, and so on. Is there any sense on that? Is it half? Is it?
I will give you the 2 seconds. We have no quantification on how much is which and which. I would say that what we covered in our report was largely market-based, so unintentional, if you will. That's what we could cover. The fact that multinationals bring technology and that a lot of technology tends to be cognitive skill biased. And so since the men are doing very routine intensive jobs, we were pushed towards more female employment. We saw that in the case of Vietnam. In Brazil, we discovered, we investigated the labor mobility channel. That is, when workers leave multinationals and enter a domestic firm, do they bring something, whether it's intentional policies? I would love to be able to investigate that, can't say, but women in the firms that tend to hire more multinational workers, former multinational workers, may have slightly smaller gender wage gaps. Again, marginal. So I would say that what I feel comfortable saying to you here is that these are unintentional. And again, they're not large, but that's a good thing. They were also not negative. I did not find negative implications of FDI on gender inequality. But I think that's a wonderful question to move forward. Also reiterating in our limited time, collaboration among the IOs. I think that is a way that we can all move forward. Having the World Bank, work with the WTO, work with UNCTAD, rather than, again, as an outsider, little bit of competition. Competition can be good, but not always. Cooperation is good too.
Thanks, Jennifer. Appreciate that. And yes, Amelia put the link to our report, all the case studies as well. Yeah, we're very happy for that all to be picked up. So we have a little bit of time left still. So I'm going to Farouk. Can I pass the floor to you? I see you have your hand raised, and I would in any case like to give you a chance for a few more words.
Well, this is not a question, but I was quite struck by the fact that many speakers, such as Ugo Panizza, Xiaolin Fu, talked about drilling down to more sort of country level data. Jennifer Poole mentioned regulation, and I guess she meant the institutional context. And then I was very interested in what Jon Nyarko said about how the UAE and the countries around that have transformed themselves from desert into transshipment hubs. And what echoed in my mind was a couple of studies that I did a few years ago from data from 2004 to 2016, where the dependent variable was really the key issue of our time. Why do some countries receive more FDI compared to their GDP than others? So FDI to GDP was the dependent variable. And there are many things, many factors which we can put into the regression, such as the availability of land or taxation, electricity, and so on. But here's what stood out for 189 countries, which is the number one most consistent explanatory variable was the efficiency of trade across borders. And this echoes what has been said about the UAE, from desert into very high-tech export-import transshipment hubs. The second thing that emerged out of these 189 nation analyses was the effectiveness of legal recourse. The third one was the ease or difficulty of entry. And when we did the same study for the subset of emerging countries, what came out was the availability of credit. And a very interesting thing, in the emerging countries subset, apparently these are all ceteris paribus, other things being equal kind of statements. More FDI went into countries with weaker availability of credit. And these are interesting questions to explore in further research. Protection of investor interests and the increasingly important issue of exit or insolvency, which in some emerging countries can drag on for years and years. There's bizarre examples of some foreign investors having to keep paying their workers, even though the operation has been shut down for years. So anyway, the idea of why some countries get more or less FDI remains at the very heart of UNCTAD and other investigations. So I thought a lot of your comments about the institutional context, regulations at the country level needs further research. Thank you.
Thanks, Farouk. That's good encouragement. I appreciate that. And you were quite concise there. So we have some minutes left, and I realize I skipped Xalan, who also had her hand raised first. So Xalan, I wouldn't want to. You have a few minutes. Would you? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to answer your question, but also this really relates to Sariana's example on the green transformation in India. So huge market demand and huge gap in investment. So need foreign investment. So even foreign investment to enter in what kind of mode? So from development perspective, Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize laureate, said, development as capabilities, development as freedom. So developed local capabilities is very important. And transfer the knowledge to the local community, very important. And what is the best way? In production, not only the codified knowledge, patents, but very important is all the also the tacit knowledge, technological and managerial tacit knowledge. And these won't be transferred by just a patent waiving or kind of wholly foreign owned firms. More effectively will be within using the joint ventures. That is why we proposed joint ventures for this vaccine production global-wise, and also the successful case is in green technology, in renewable energy, joint ventures are found. There is a special issue, a fund to be an effective tool. So that's why we propose, and our title of the paper is "The World Has a Unique Opportunity." And if we succeed in the vaccine area, and then we can apply this to other areas, provide global public good. So it's not, in all areas, it's really in the areas for the global public goods. And the multinationals, if they keep on innovate, they won't need to fear that their local partners will take away their technology and push them out of the country. I stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Alan, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We're getting very close to the end. Heinz, if you can say it in 30 seconds, because you see your hand raised. You're on.
Yes, Richard. I'll be very Germanic now. Basically, I have just 3 points for reflection, which partly came up implicitly.
10 seconds each.
Also to ask, sorry?
10 seconds each.
Yeah, okay. One is, what's about the decolonization of research and our research methods, and a more equitable, including a more equitable North-South collaboration between academia. The other one is, are we perhaps addressing this, will be actually also wanting to be drawn into the normative debates and taking a stance on issue. And very lastly, again, looking at impact, part of a pluralistic impact will also have to be, of course, education.
Sorry, the last one?
As if we look at impact that we are making with our research, it's not just in academia, practice, policymaking, but in education.
Okay.
That's, I think, it's very important part of impact. So 3 things: decolonize.
Really appreciate that, Heinz, and especially the idea of the North-South collaboration in university research. It's really something we should be working on. So I'm going to conclude now, because for our external audience, we will conclude this at 18:30 precisely. So there's not much time for wrap up. Just to say that the proceedings of all of the work of the academic track are being kept by our friends in AIB and by our student friends who are taking notes on everything. So we will capture all that. And the idea is to have perspectives papers after this conference, covering the 3 specific topics covered by AIB, and perhaps an overview of all of the discourse that we have had at WIF, and we will be looking at ways to publish that. So I'm going to conclude there. Otherwise, it's going to look very ugly to be cut off like that from the screen. So I want to just thank you all very much for having participated as speakers and panelists in this event. I really appreciate the collaboration, and I'm certain that I will see many of you soon again in our work. Thank you so much.